So we're looking at the Gospel of Mark, and it's kind of interesting. Every year there's an assigned reading. Now after 2,000 years, these are pretty familiar to us. We get Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're in the year of Mark. But every time the year of Mark comes up, all of the folks that help pastors and other worship leaders plan for the event said, but you could read John. If you insist, you can read Mark, but you could read John. And there's a reason for that. You might notice that in the gospel reading that we had today, there are a few things missing. One is a big thing that is missing. Any thoughts? Jesus is missing. It seems like if you're going to say, hey, there was this amazing resurrection, that you would want to, pull a guy out of a closet and say, hey, look, right? And yet that's not a part of the story at all. In fact, you might have heard in the tone in which I read it, a little contrary to the children's sermon, but at the same time, we're all here. Obviously, the word got out. But it's interesting the way in which it ends. They flee from the tomb and tell no one anything because they were afraid. Now, as you were getting dressed this morning and getting ready to come over here, fear probably wasn't emotion number one. Concern about details of the day, is that shirt ironed, whatever the case might be. But this idea of some kind of existential fear is probably not something that was on our radar. But when we think of that time and place, this wasn't a funeral that they had been to of an old friend that was dearly loved. This was the tragic execution by the state. Am I being watched when I go to the tomb? Is there somebody recording who is visiting this place? Are the authorities going to come after us? There are all kinds of reasons to be desperately afraid. But the thing I want to touch on a little bit today is that walk early in the morning on the first day of the week, Sunday. Now, as a general rule, I'm not an early morning guy, but on Sundays, I am usually on foot from the parsonage closer to Midtown and walking 15, 20 minutes to get here. There's big chunks of the year, like today, where that's in the dark. And there are things that I can't hear at that time of day, namely the 101. Can't be heard at 5:30 on a Sunday morning. You can hear birds. There are birds around here. Did you know that? You can hear all kinds of things, but it's a different set of sounds when it's quieter. All of that quiet is something that strikes me about Easter morning as they would have walked over. A couple years ago, I read an article in the New York Times about Orfield Laboratories in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They are famous for a room in their building. Just one room. It is an anechoic room, a room without echo. It is the quietest place on earth. It is a double-walled steel, six-sided box inside of a five-sided room that is 12 inches of concrete. And then if you've seen pictures of recording studios, all of that foam on the inside. In addition to commercial uses, like how quiet is that dishwasher actually, you can pay $600 an hour to sit in there, to experience that. A lot of people don't make it the full hour. It's unnerving. Reportedly, what happens is you get kind of focused and then realize how much noise your own body makes, pushing blood around, all kinds of things, in this absolute silence. Think of those other places in this world that are silent. Perhaps it's a walk to church, but there are places that are harder, right? Like the exam room at the doctor's office before the doctor comes in is pretty quiet, right? I remember when I was in Krakow, Poland on my sabbatical this last fall for the Lutheran World Federation Assembly, and I had a chance to visit some of the cathedrals in town, and one of them in particular I was struck by because it was a cathedral, but the seating for it was very small. What it was a very elaborate mausoleum. It was endless tombs and crypts. It was very quiet. But unlike the chamber in Minneapolis, there were echoes of footsteps of others, whispers, things like this. The sounds of when you are around the dead, right? There are lots of silent places like that. We think of families beneath the rubble in Gaza. We think of hostages in cells in Gaza. We think of all of those worries and concerns for those trapped under the water, under the bridge in Baltimore. The silent and quiet places. The Marys show up at the tomb, and it would have been very quiet, aside from the birds, but it's hard to know with all the preoccupation if they would have had a sense to listen to that, but rather the fears and worries. And suddenly the stone is rolled out of the way already. Is this good news? Not clear. They peek in. It says, there's a young man dressed in white. There's some guy there, right? That they see. They are terrified. The Greek word is where we get phobia. Terrified. The sense of dread and concern about all of the things that might be going on. But one of the things that happens in this space, it's a quiet space, but it's open. It's open. Tombs aren't supposed to be open, right? They're supposed to be closed. You don't expect to go to a funeral and watch the casket put in the ground and covered and then go back the next day and it's dug up and open. That's not the way it works. It stays closed. But when we gather today on Easter, we're mindful that spaces that were closed and perhaps even painfully and brutally quiet have become open. There is fresh air in these spaces. They're no longer perfectly silent, but there are voices, perhaps even the sounds of birds and others. As we gather at Easter time, which is attached to Passover, we know it is this time of year, we're mindful of the new leaves and the flowers and the green grass, the new life that comes. But I think the way I would say it is that there are doors that are opened, stones that are rolled aside. There is an openness that our brains would suggest doesn't work that way, can't be that way. That's not the way it works. But if there's nothing else that we take away from this story, it's that Jesus Christ creates a way where it is not expected. That stones are rolled away, doors are opened in the most quiet and even painful places in our lives. A way is created to new life where it was unexpected and where we didn't see it. And so on this Easter, we cry out, Alleluia, in the midst of the silences and worries and fears of this life, recognizing that we may not always see the path forward, but Christ is in fact already there. Amen.